Welcome to a story about the price of pride, and the strange relief that comes when you finally stop trying to earn the love of someone who is never going to give it freely. My name is Daniel Okafor Reyes, and for 34 years I believed that if I just achieved enough, my father would finally see me as something other than a disappointment. I was wrong about that, but I was right about something else, that the day would come when I would stop asking the question altogether. That day arrived at my family's annual reunion, in front of 63 relatives, a caterer, and a banner that read, "The Okafor Reyes family, rooted in love," when my father stood up with a glass of wine in his hand and called me a disgrace. I should explain how we got there. My father, Patrick Okafor Reyes, built a logistics company from nothing in the early 90s, the kind of self-made man story that gets repeated at every family gathering until it calcifies into myth. He worked 16-hour days, slept in his warehouse twice a week during the lean years, and by the time I was in high school, he had become the kind of man whose presence changed the temperature of a room. He was also the kind of man who measured love in achievement, and who never let any of his 3 children forget it. My older brother, Marcus, became a surgeon. My younger sister, Adiz, became a corporate attorney at 28. And I became, in my father's words, the one who plays with computers. What my father never understood or never cared to understand was that I had spent the last 12 years building a cybersecurity consultancy that now protected the digital infrastructure of 4 Fortune 500 companies and 2 federal agencies. He saw a son who didn't wear a suit to work, who didn't have a corner office with his name etched in brass, who didn't come home with stories about saving lives or closing 9-figure mergers. He saw a son who worked from a converted garage in Austin, wearing hoodies, doing something he didn't understand and therefore couldn't respect. I had tried for years to explain it to him. I had tried showing him articles, awards, client testimonials. Nothing landed. To my father, if he couldn't see the trophy, the achievement didn't exist. The reunion was held at my Aunt Ngozie's property outside Houston, a sprawling estate with a lake and enough land that the family could spread across 3 pavilions without ever quite running into each other, which in our family was sometimes the point. I had flown in the night before, jet-lagged from closing a deal in Singapore, and I'd told myself, the way I always did, that this year would be different. This year I would simply enjoy my cousins, eat my grandmother's jollof rice, and not let my father's comments find their mark. I had made this promise to myself at every reunion since I was 22. I had never once kept it. The trouble started, as it usually did, during the toasts. My father loved toasts. He loved standing at the head of a gathering with a glass raised, narrating the family's accomplishments like a man reading from a ledger. He went down the list that year with his usual rhythm. Marcus, who had just been named chief of surgery at a hospital in Atlanta. Adiz, who had made partner at her firm 2 years ahead of schedule. My cousin Chitty, who had just been accepted into a doctoral program at Stanford. Each name was met with applause, and my father beamed like a man counting his returns on investment. Then he paused, glass still raised, and his eyes found me across the lawn. "And then there's Daniel," he said, and the way he said my name had a weight to it that made the air around me go still. 34 years old. No wife. No degree he ever finished using. Working out of his garage doing God knows what with computers, calling it a business. He laughed, the kind of laugh that invites others to laugh with you. And some of them did, uncertainly, glancing at me to gauge whether this was the kind of teasing our family did or something else. I used to tell people my son was in tech. Now I just say he's figuring things out. At 34. He shook his head, took a sip of his wine, and delivered the line that would end up defining the rest of that day. "Honestly, of all my children, he's the disgrace. The one I don't know what to do with." There was a silence that followed, the particular silence of 100 people deciding simultaneously whether to laugh, intervene, or look at their plates. My mother, who had divorced my father 11 years earlier and rarely attended these gatherings, was not there to defend me. My siblings looked down. Marcus, to his credit, opened his mouth as if to say something, but my father had already moved on to toasting my Aunt Ngozie's new sunroom, as though he had not just detonated something in the middle of his own family. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because I think people expect rage, and what I actually felt was something closer to clarity. For years I had absorbed my father's comments as wounds, each one reopening the last, because some part of me still believed that if I just explained myself correctly, the wound would finally close for good. But standing on that lawn, watching him toast a sunroom 30 seconds after calling me a disgrace in front of everyone I had grown up with, I understood with total certainty that there was no version of my explanation that would ever land, because my father wasn't actually confused about what I did for a living. He simply needed someone in the family hierarchy to occupy the position of the disappointment, and he had decided, perhaps decades ago, that the position was mine. I didn't make a scene. I want to be clear about that because in the version of this story that got passed around the family afterward, some people embellished it into a shouting match which never happened. What I did was excuse myself from the table, walk to my car, and retrieve an envelope I had been carrying in my laptop bag for exactly this kind of occasion, though I hadn't known until that moment that I would actually use it. Here is what I need to explain. The part one had never told my father, never told anyone in my family except my mother, who had sworn to keep it quiet at my request. 18 months earlier, my consultancy had identified and patched a critical vulnerability in the supply chain software used by a logistics conglomerate that, as it happened, had acquired my father's old company 7 years prior. After he sold it during a downturn, he never fully recovered from emotionally. The vulnerability, if exploited, would have allowed bad actors to manipulate shipment routing across 40% of the company's North American freight network, the same network my father had built his name on, the network that still, in some small administrative corner, bore the ghost of the systems he had personally designed in the 90s. My team didn't just patch it. We rebuilt the architecture from the ground up, modernizing systems that, ironically, still ran on logic my father had laid down 30 years earlier. The company's board had sent a formal letter of commendation, along with documentation crediting my team specifically, by name, for what their chief operations officer called the most significant infrastructure save in company history. I had requested at the time that they include in the letter a brief technical summary of the original system's design, because I wanted my father to understand something he'd never let me say to his face, that I hadn't rejected what he built. I had spent years protecting it quietly, professionally, without ever being thanked or even acknowledged, because I never told him I'd taken the contract in the first place. I told the board to keep my involvement confidential from the client relationship side. I never wanted credit. I wanted, I think, only for him to someday understand, if the moment ever came, that his disgrace of a son had been the one standing guard over his legacy when no one else could. I walked back across the lawn carrying that envelope and found my father near the dessert table, still glowing from the reception of his toast. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for an apology. I simply handed him the envelope and said, "This is the company you sold. I led the team that saved its entire freight network 18 months ago. I didn't tell you because I didn't think you'd believe me, and after today I know I was right." Then I told him I loved him, which surprised even me as the words left my mouth, and that I hoped someday he'd understand that respect isn't something children owe their parents unconditionally. It's something parents have to earn too, the same as everyone else. And then I left. I didn't wait for him to open it. I didn't wait to watch his face change. I got in my car, drove to the airport 3 hours early, and sat in the terminal feeling, for the first time in over a decade, like I had finally put something down that I'd been carrying since I was a teenager. I learned what happened next from my sister, who called me 2 days later, her voice still carrying the particular astonishment of someone who had watched a myth collapse in real time. My father had opened the envelope at the dessert table, read the letter once, then read it again, then asked Marcus, who happened to be standing nearby, to confirm that the company named in the letter was in fact the one he had founded and sold. When Marcus confirmed it, My father reportedly sat down on a folding chair near the lake and didn't speak for almost 20 minutes. Adi said he kept rereading the technical summary, the one I had specifically requested, the part where the board described how the new architecture preserved and modernized the original routing logic designed decades earlier by a visionary in freight technology, a phrase the COO had used in our calls and that I'd insisted stay in the letter, because I wanted my father to see in writing from people who owed him nothing, that what he built had mattered. My father called me that night. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, there was a long silence before he spoke, and when he finally did, his voice didn't sound like the voice from the toast. It sounded smaller, more uncertain. The voice of a man recalculating something he had assumed was settled. He asked why I never told him. I told him the truth, that I had tried to tell him things for years and had learned that he only heard what fit the story he'd already written about me. He didn't argue with that. That, more than anything else he said, told me how much that envelope had actually shifted in him, because my father did not concede points easily, not in business, not in arguments, and certainly not with his children. I won't pretend this story ends with a clean reconciliation because that isn't honest, and I think stories that promise easy redemption do a disservice to anyone who has actually lived through something like this. My father and I have spoken several times since the reunion. He has asked me, with what I believe is genuine curiosity for the first time in my adult life, what exactly my work involves. He has not apologized in the direct way I used to fantasize about as a teenager, the dramatic, tearful apology that fixes everything in one scene. Instead, what I've gotten is smaller and I've come to believe more real. A man in his late 60s slowly, awkwardly trying to revise 3 decades of assumptions about his own son one phone call at a time. 2 weeks ago, he asked if he could visit my office in Austin. I said yes. I don't know exactly what that visit will look like, or whether it will change the fundamental architecture of our relationship any more than I changed the fundamental architecture of his old company's freight network. But I've learned something from both projects. You don't always need to tear the whole system down and start over. Sometimes you just need to find the parts worth preserving, repair the parts that are failing, and be patient with how long it takes for something old to start running properly again. What I keep coming back to in the weeks since the reunion is not the toast itself, painful as it was, but the walk back across that lawn. I think about how calm I felt, how little I needed him to react in any particular way for the moment to feel complete. For years I had imagined that proving myself to my father would feel like triumph, like finally winning something I'd been chasing since childhood. It didn't feel like that at all. It felt like setting down a bag I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it had weight. I didn't need him to call me a success. I needed, finally, to stop needing that from him at all, and the envelope, as it turned out, was never really for him. It was the last thing I needed to do for myself, the final proof I needed to offer not to my father, but to the version of me that had spent 34 years believing his approval was the only currency that mattered. I know now that it wasn't and hasn't been for a long time. The Disgrace, it turns out, was never the work I did in a garage in Austin. It was the years I spent waiting for permission to be proud of it.